An orphan finds her photo in a CEO's wallet, and her world is turned upside down. She doesn't know him, but he drops to his knees, begging for forgiveness. Why does this powerful man carry her picture? And what secret could be so devastating that it brings him to tears? As their connection begins to unravel, one truth threatens to change both their lives forever. What is he hiding? And can she ever forgive him for a past he can't take back? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. In his corner office on the 50th floor of Stanton Enterprises, Richard Stanton sat behind his mahogany desk, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the quarterly reports before him. The December sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the emptiness of the spacious room. Despite the expensive artwork adorning the walls and the pristine leather furniture, the office felt as cold as its owner's reputation. Richard adjusted his perfectly pressed tie and frowned at the numbers. Profit margins were up 15% this quarter. Normally, this would bring a satisfied smile to his face. Today, however, something felt different. His gaze drifted to a small news clipping tucked away in his desk drawer, barely visible beneath a stack of papers. The headline read, "Local Orphanage Faces Financial Crisis." A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out, his voice carrying its usual authoritative tone. Emily Saunders, his secretary of 15 years, entered with a stack of papers. Her efficient demeanor faltered slightly when she noticed the unusual distraction in her boss's eyes. "The board members are assembled for the quarterly meeting, Mr. Stanton." "Thank you, Emily." Richard stood up, straightening his suit jacket. He paused, then added, "There's something else I'd like you to arrange." Emily raised her eyebrows slightly, pen poised over her notepad. "Yes, sir?" "I want to organize a Christmas charity event here at Stanton Enterprises. We'll invite the children from St. Mary's Orphanage." The words came out matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing a routine business merger. Emily's pen froze mid-stroke. In 15 years, Richard Stanton had never shown interest in charity events, let alone ones involving children. The man who had once famously said, "Sentiment has no place in business," was now suggesting a Christmas party for orphans? "Sir," she managed to say, trying to hide her surprise. "Is there a problem?" Richard's tone carried a hint of challenge. "No, not at all," Emily quickly responded. "I'll start making arrangements right away. How many children should we expect?" "There are 23 children currently at St. Mary's," Richard answered without hesitation, then caught himself. "According to their website, of course." Emily nodded, making notes, but her mind was racing. Since when did Richard Stanton browse orphanage websites? In the boardroom, the announcement met with stunned silence. Board members exchanged glances across the polished conference table, their expressions ranging from confusion to concern. "A Christmas party?" Gerald Matthews, the CFO, finally spoke up. "Richard, we've never done anything like this before. Our shareholders will appreciate the positive publicity," Richard cut in smoothly. "Besides, it's time Stanton Enterprises showed some community spirit." The words felt foreign on his tongue, but something in his stern expression discouraged further argument. As the meeting concluded, Richard noticed the whispers, the curious glances. His reputation as the Ice King of corporate America was well earned through years of ruthless business decisions and an unwavering focus on the bottom line. This sudden interest in charity work would certainly raise eyebrows. Back in his office, Richard stood at the window, watching the snow begin to fall over the city. His reflection stared back at him, gray hair at the temples, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a few years ago. Behind him, he could hear Emily already making phone calls, setting his plan in motion. His hand unconsciously moved to his breast pocket, where a worn photograph was carefully hidden. He had carried it for 20 years, never showing it to anyone. The image of a young woman with bright eyes and a gentle smile remained clear despite the creases in the paper. Clara Edwards. The name still had the power to make his heart clench with regret. At St. Mary's Orphanage, the old brick building buzzed with excitement. Tiny hands pressed against frosted window panes as children watched the first snowflakes of December drift down from the pearl gray sky. In the girls' dormitory, 5-year-old Yana stood on tiptoe in front of a mirror, carefully smoothing down her favorite red dress with its white lace collar. "You're acting like we're going to meet the president or something," Tommy, one of the older boys, teased from the doorway. "It's just some boring business party." Yana stuck out her tongue at him, but her small fingers still fidgeted with the ribbon in her curly brown hair. "Ms. Roberts says it's going to be magical, like a real Christmas party with decorations and everything." "And cake," piped up Sarah, her best friend and bunkmate. "Don't forget about the cake." The other children gathered around, some still pulling on warm sweaters and mittens. Jenny, one of the older girls, rolled her eyes. "Rich people only do this stuff to feel better about themselves. They probably won't even talk to us." Yana's bright smile dimmed a little, but before she could respond, Ms. Roberts appeared in the doorway. The orphanage director's kind face broke into a warm smile as she took in Yana's carefully arranged outfit. "My goodness, don't you look lovely?" Ms. Roberts knelt down to straighten Yana's ribbon. Her eyes held a strange mixture of joy and something else. Was it worry? As she looked at the little girl. "Are you excited about the party, sweetheart?" Yana nodded enthusiastically, her previous doubts forgotten. "Do you think they'll have a Christmas tree as tall as our building?" Ms. Roberts laughed, the sound warm and gentle like summer rain. "Well, I heard Stanton Enterprises has very tall ceilings, so maybe. Now everyone line up for the bus check." The children scrambled to form a line, their boots squeaking on the old wooden floors. Yana found herself between Sarah and Marcus, clutching her worn teddy bear, Mr. Whiskers, to her chest. She debated whether bringing him was babyish, but she couldn't imagine going on such a big adventure without him. "Yana," Ms. Roberts called softly, pulling her aside for a moment. "Remember what we talked about? About being yourself?" The little girl nodded solemnly, "Because that's the best thing I can be." "That's right, sweetheart." Ms. Roberts touched Yana's cheek gently. "Just enjoy the party and have fun. Sometimes wonderful surprises come when we least expect them." As they boarded the old yellow bus, Yana claimed a window seat, pressing her nose against the cold glass. The city looked different in the snow, like a picture from one of their storybooks. Tall buildings reached up toward the clouds, their windows twinkling like stars in the early winter dusk. "Look, Mr. Whiskers," she whispered to her bear. "Everything's so pretty." Her eyes widened as they passed shop windows decorated with Christmas displays, each one more magical than the last. Sarah leaned over from the seat behind her. "Maybe we'll get presents." "Maybe we'll get adopted," whispered Marcus from across the aisle, but quickly looked away when the other children turned to stare at him. Yana hugged Mr. Whiskers tighter, watching her breath fog up the window. She'd never been to a real office building before. Would it be as fancy as she imagined? Would there really be a giant Christmas tree? As the bus wound its way through the snowy streets, she felt a strange flutter in her stomach, like butterflies dancing. Something about this party felt different. Special somehow, though she couldn't explain why. The grand ballroom of Stanton Enterprises took the children's breath away. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, their light dancing off silver and gold decorations that transformed the normally austere space into a Christmas wonderland. True to the rumors, an enormous Christmas tree dominated one corner, stretching nearly 20 feet toward the ceiling, its thousands of twinkling lights reflecting in the children's wide eyes. "It's like magic," Yana whispered to Mr. Whiskers, clutching him close as she took in the scene. Garlands of evergreen wrapped with red ribbon draped across the walls, and dozens of smaller trees lined the perimeter, each decorated in different themes. The air smelled of pine needles, cinnamon, and freshly baked cookies. A woman with kind eyes and auburn hair knelt down beside her. "Hello there, I'm Emily. And who might this handsome fellow be?" she asked, gently touching Mr. Whiskers' worn paw. "This is Mr. Whiskers," Yana replied shyly. "He's never been to a fancy party before." Emily's laugh was warm and genuine. "Well, we're honored to have both of you here. Would you like to see the cookie decoration station? We have every color of frosting you can imagine." Before Yana could answer, a hush fell over the room. She turned to see a tall man in an expensive suit standing in the doorway. His presence seemed to make the room smaller somehow, like a storm cloud blocking out the sun. This must be Mr. Stanton, she thought, remembering the name from the invitation. Richard Stanton surveyed the scene with an unreadable expression, his steel gray eyes scanning the room as if searching for something. When his gaze passed over Yana, she felt a strange flutter in her chest, but he quickly looked away, moving to stand near the wall where he could observe everything from a distance. Emily squeezed Yana's shoulder reassuringly. "Don't mind Mr. Stanton, sweetheart. He's just not used to having so many guests." She guided Yana toward a table laden with cookies and decorating supplies. "Now, let's see what masterpiece you can create." While other staff members cheerfully helped children frost cookies and make ornaments, Richard remained apart, his shoulders tense beneath his perfectly tailored suit. Every few minutes, his eyes would drift back to where Yana sat, though he quickly looked away whenever she glanced in his direction. The ballroom was full of activity stations, a face-painting corner where children emerged with rosy-cheeked snowmen and glittering snowflakes on their cheeks, a letter-writing station for Santa, and even a photo booth with props and costumes. The sound of children's laughter echoed off the high ceilings, mixing with the soft Christmas music playing through hidden speakers. Yana finished decorating her third cookie, carefully adding silver sprinkles to make it sparkle like the chandeliers above. When she looked up to show Emily her creation, something caught her eye. A partially open door leading to a quieter hallway, where more Christmas trees twinkled invitingly. Curious about what other wonders this magical place might hold, she slipped away from the table, Mr. Whiskers tucked securely under her arm. From his position near the wall, Richard noticed her small figure moving toward the hallway, but before he could react, a board member approached him with questions about the event's budget, momentarily drawing his attention away from the wandering child. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, lined with closed doors and twinkling Christmas trees. Yana's small footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet as she wandered, Mr. Whiskers held tightly against her chest. At the end of the corridor, a pair of massive wooden doors stood slightly ajar, golden light spilling through the gap. "Look, Mr. Whiskers," she whispered to her teddy bear. "It must be something special behind those big doors." Pushing one door open just enough to slip through, Yana found herself in the biggest office she'd ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city below, where tiny cars moved like colorful ants through the streets. A massive desk of dark wood dominated one end of the room, its surface neat and organized. Everything seemed to shine, from the polished marble floors to the gleaming metal sculptures that decorated various corners. "Wow," Yana breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. She approached the desk carefully, standing on her tiptoes to see what lay on its surface. A golden nameplate caught her attention. Richard Stanton, CEO. On a side table near the desk, a collection of small crystal figurines caught the light. Yana reached out to touch one that looked like a delicate swan, fascinated by how it sparkled. But as she stretched, Mr. Whiskers' paw accidentally knocked against the figure. The crystal swan teetered for a heart-stopping moment before falling onto its side with a small clink. "Oh no," Yana gasped, quickly setting it upright again. "I'm sorry, little swan." "I see I have an unexpected visitor," a deep voice said from the doorway. Yana spun around, clutching Mr. Whiskers tightly. Richard Stanton stood there, his tall frame filling the doorway. But instead of the stern expression she expected, his face held a hint of something softer, almost like a smile. "I'm sorry, Mr. Stanton," Yana said quickly. "I was just exploring with Mr. Whiskers. Your office is very pretty." Richard's expression softened further as he stepped into the room. "Is that so? And who might Mr. Whiskers be?" Yana held up her teddy bear. "He's my best friend. He keeps me company at the orphanage." Something flickered in Richard's eyes, a flash of emotion quickly hidden. He walked closer and knelt down to Yana's level, surprising himself with the gesture. "Well, Mr. Whiskers seems like a very fine companion. Did you enjoy the party?" "Oh, yes." Yana nodded enthusiastically. "Everything is so beautiful. Even your little swan is pretty, but I almost broke it. I'm really sorry." Richard glanced at the crystal figurine, then back at Yana's worried face. "No harm done. But perhaps we should head back to the ballroom? I believe they're about to serve ice cream. Yana's face lit up. Ice cream? Really? Really, Richard confirmed, standing and offering his hand without thinking. When Yana's small fingers slipped into his, something warm stirred in his chest. As they walked toward the door, Yana chattering about her favorite ice cream flavors, Richard's leather wallet slipped unnoticed from his jacket pocket, landing silently on the plush carpet behind them. Just before they reached the door, Yana spotted something dark on the carpet. "Oh, you dropped something, Mr. Stanton." She darted back, her small hands scooping up the leather wallet. As she held it out to him, the wallet fell open and a photograph fluttered to the floor. Yana bent to pick it up but froze when she saw the image. Her bright eyes widened and she stared at the picture with growing amazement. "That's me," she exclaimed, her voice filled with wonder and confusion. "But I'm littler in the picture. How do you have a picture of me?" Richard stopped breathing for a moment. His carefully constructed world seemed to tilt on its axis. The photograph, one he'd obtained from the orphanage's records, showed a newborn Yana, barely a day old, wrapped in a pink blanket. His legs felt weak, and before he knew what was happening, he dropped to his knees in front of her. His hands trembled as he reached out, pulling her into a tight embrace. Tears he'd held back for 5 long years began to fall. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Yana." Yana stood still in his embrace, confused by this sudden display of emotion from the usually stern man. She awkwardly patted his back with her free hand, still clutching Mr. Whiskers with the other. "Why are you crying, Mr. Stanton? Did I do something wrong?" Richard pulled back slightly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. You've never done anything wrong." The sound of Christmas carols and children's laughter drifted down the hallway from the ballroom, a stark contrast to the heavy emotional moment unfolding in the office. Yana looked at the photograph again, then at Richard's tear-stained face. "Should we go back to the party?" she asked softly, unsure how to handle this strange situation. "They have ice cream, remember?" Richard managed a weak smile, standing up on shaky legs. "Yes, we should." He took her small hand in his again, but now his touch was different, gentler, more protective. As they walked back toward the festivities, he couldn't stop glancing down at her, his heart aching with each step. The ballroom was alive with joy and celebration. Children ran around playing games, staff members handed out treats, and holiday music filled the air. But Richard barely noticed any of it. His eyes kept returning to Yana as she joined a group of children near the ice cream station, her earlier confusion temporarily forgotten in the excitement of choosing between chocolate and vanilla. Emily approached him with a stack of papers requiring his signature, but he could barely focus on what she was saying. His mind was consumed by the weight of the moment that had just passed and the magnitude of what lay ahead. The photograph in his wallet seemed to burn against his chest where he'd hastily tucked it away. As he watched Yana laugh with her friends, ice cream smeared adorably across her chin, Richard knew his carefully ordered world would never be the same. And for the first time in his life, that thought didn't terrify him. It filled him with hope. The office grew quiet as evening settled over the city. Richard sat at his desk, the photograph held loosely in his trembling hands. The party decorations had been cleared away, but traces of glitter still sparkled on the carpet, tiny reminders of the day that had changed everything. He traced the outline of baby Yana's face in the photograph with his finger. Memories he'd tried so hard to suppress came flooding back. Clara's hopeful smile when she told him about the pregnancy, the fear that had gripped him, the terrible choices he'd made. "I was such a coward," he whispered to the empty room. The weight of his past decisions pressed heavily on his chest. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Emily stood in the doorway, a stack of papers clutched to her chest. Her eyes held concern, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "Sir, I have the donation receipts from today's event ready for your signature." She placed them carefully on his desk, pretending not to notice his red-rimmed eyes or the photograph in his hands. "Thank you, Emily." His voice was rough with emotion. He cleared his throat and straightened in his chair, trying to regain his usual composure. Emily hesitated by the desk. "It was a wonderful party, Mr. Stanton. The children were so happy." She paused, then added softly, "Especially little Yana. She has such a bright spirit." Richard's hand tightened on the photograph. "Yes, she does." The words came out barely above a whisper. Emily nodded and turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "Sir, whatever's troubling you, sometimes the hardest steps are the most important ones we take." With that, she quietly closed the door behind her. Meanwhile, at the orphanage, Yana sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by her closest friends. Mr. Whiskers was propped up against her pillow as she recounted the strange encounter. "And then he just started crying," she explained, her small brow furrowed in confusion. But not sad crying exactly. Different crying. Sarah, her best friend, hugged her knees to her chest. Maybe he was just really happy about Christmas. "No," Yana shook her head, playing with the hem of her dress. "It was after he saw the picture of me as a baby. I didn't even know there were pictures of me that old." "That's weird," Tommy chimed in from his perch on the windowsill. "Why would he have your baby picture?" Yana flopped back on her bed, staring up at the glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling. "I don't know, but he seemed different after that. Like he wanted to tell me something really important but couldn't find the words." The children fell silent, pondering this mystery. Outside their window, snow had begun to fall, adding to the dreamlike quality of the day's events. "Do you think," Yana started, then stopped, uncertain how to express the strange feeling growing in her heart. "Do you think he might know something about where I came from?" Her friends exchanged glances, not knowing how to answer. The question hung in the air, mixing with the shadows of early evening and the distant sound of younger children getting ready for bed. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Richard's office, but he barely noticed its warmth. His eyes were fixed on the photograph in his wallet. Baby Yana, just hours old, wrapped in a pink blanket. The image blurred as his mind drifted back 15 years, to a very different morning. Clara Edwards had stood in this same office, her hands clasped protectively over her stomach. She'd worn a simple blue dress, her dark hair falling in gentle waves around her face. Her eyes had held both hope and fear as she'd told him about the baby. "I'm keeping it, Richard," she'd said, her voice trembling but determined. "I know this wasn't planned, but this is impossible." His younger self had cut her off, standing behind his desk like a shield. "The company is about to go public. The board would never accept this scandal. There must be other options." The memory of Clara's face crumpling made present-day Richard wince. He remembered how she'd reached for him, trying one last time. "We could make it work. We could be a family." But he'd turned away, his ambition drowning out the quiet voice in his heart that had wanted to reach back. "I'll provide financial support, of course, but I can't be involved. The timing, it's just not possible." "Money?" Clara's voice had turned hard with hurt. "You think that's what I came here for? I thought you might actually care." She'd walked out of his office that day and out of his life. He'd told himself it was for the best, that he was protecting his company, his future. He'd buried himself in work, climbing higher and higher in the corporate world, until the memory of Clara and their unborn child became nothing more than a dull ache he could ignore. A knock at his door jolted Richard back to the present. Emily stood there, concern evident in her expression. "Mr. Stanton? The board meeting started 5 minutes ago. Should I tell them you're delayed?" Richard blinked, realizing he'd completely forgotten about the meeting. His hands were shaking as he tried to gather his papers. "Sir?" Emily stepped closer, her voice gentler. "Is everything all right? You seem different since yesterday's party." "I'm fine," he said automatically, but his voice cracked on the words. He sat heavily in his chair, the weight of 15 years of regret pressing down on him. Emily hesitated, then placed a cup of coffee on his desk. Whatever it is, Mr. Stanton, sometimes talking about it helps. Richard stared at the steaming cup, seeing instead Clara's face, then Yana's. The same dark eyes, the same gentle spirit. He'd abandoned them both. First the mother, then the daughter. The success he'd chosen instead suddenly felt hollow, meaningless. "Tell the board I'll be late," he managed to say. Emily nodded and quietly closed the door, leaving him alone with his memories and the growing realization of how much his choices had cost him, and more importantly, how much they had cost his daughter. The sleek black Mercedes looked out of place parked in front of the weathered brick building of St. Mary's Orphanage. Richard sat in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He'd left the board meeting early, driven by an impulse he couldn't explain, or perhaps one he didn't want to admit to himself. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel driveway. The sound of children's laughter drifted from somewhere behind the building, making his heart squeeze uncomfortably in his chest. Mrs. Harriet Lawson opened the front door before he could even knock, her eyes widening in surprise. "Mr. Stanton, this is unexpected." "I apologize for not calling ahead," Richard said, straightening his tie nervously. "I wanted to thank you personally for bringing the children to our Christmas event." Mrs. Lawson's kind face held a hint of skepticism, but she smiled warmly. "Please come in." The inside of the orphanage was modest but clean, with children's artwork decorating the walls. A familiar voice rang out from the top of the stairs. "Mr. Stanton!" Yana came bounding down, her dark curls bouncing with each step. She wore mismatched socks and a slightly too big sweater with a unicorn on it. "Did you come to see our house?" Richard felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crack at the sight of her smile, Clara's smile. Yes, if that's all right. I'll show you everything." Yana grabbed his hand without hesitation, tugging him forward. Richard glanced at Mrs. Lawson, who nodded her permission while watching them with curious eyes. Yana led him through the building like an enthusiastic tour guide. "This is where we eat breakfast," she explained, pointing to a well-worn dining room. "And this is our art room. Look, I made that picture of a butterfly." Richard found himself genuinely smiling as she showed him her artwork, noting how the butterfly's wings were different colors. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "Really? Most of the other kids say butterflies should be the same on both sides, but I think they're prettier when they're different." "I think you're absolutely right," Richard replied, his throat tight with emotion. They passed the library where several children were reading, and the playroom filled with well-loved toys. Throughout it all, Yana chattered happily, telling him stories about her friends and their adventures. "And this is my bed." She proudly showed him her small corner of the girls' dormitory. A stuffed elephant sat on her pillow, and a few books were carefully arranged on her nightstand. "His name is Trumpet," she explained, hugging the elephant. Richard noticed how few personal possessions she had, nothing like the mountain of toys and games his wealth could have provided her. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. Looking out the window, he saw children playing in the backyard, their laughter carrying through the glass. Some were jumping rope, others playing tag. They looked happy enough, but he couldn't help thinking about all the birthdays, all the Christmases, all the ordinary days he'd missed with Yana. Mrs. Lawson appeared in the doorway, her expression gentle but questioning. "Yana, sweetheart, it's almost time for afternoon lessons." "Oh." Yana turned to Richard, her face bright with hope. "Will you come visit again, Mr. Stanton?" Richard knelt down to her level, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Would you like that?" "Yes, please, you can meet all my friends next time." Back in his office, Richard stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline, the weight of his secrets pressing down on him like a physical burden. The door opened quietly, and Emily entered with her usual stack of papers, but today he couldn't pretend everything was normal. "Emily," he said, his voice unusually soft. "Could you close the door, please? There's something I need to tell you." Emily set down the papers and settled into one of the leather chairs across from his desk, her expression concerned but patient. Richard pulled out his wallet and removed the worn photograph he'd been carrying for years. 5 years ago, he began, his voice rough with emotion, there was a woman named Clara Edwards. She worked in our marketing department. He passed the photo to Emily, who studied it carefully. The image showed a younger, smiling Clara, her dark curls framing her face, curls that now adorned her daughter's head. She came to my office one day telling me she was pregnant. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. I was different then, focused only on building this company. I told her it would be better if she... He couldn't finish the sentence. Emily's eyes widened with understanding. Yana, she whispered. Richard nodded, running a hand through his graying hair. Clara died in childbirth. I found out too late. By then, Yana was already at St. Mary's. His voice cracked. I've spent 5 years trying to convince myself I made the right choice, that she was better off without me. But seeing her at the Christmas party... That's why you organized the event, Emily said softly. You wanted to see her. I didn't expect her to be so... Richard struggled to find the words. She's everything Clara was. Bright, curious, full of life. And I abandoned her, Emily. I abandoned them both. Emily leaned forward, her expression determined. You can't change the past, Richard, but you can change the future. Yana needs a father, not your guilt. I don't know how to be a father, Richard admitted, vulnerability clear in his voice. Then start small, Emily suggested, her mind already working. The orphanage always needs supplies. We could organize regular donations, books, clothes, toys. Show Yana you care through actions, not just words. Richard looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. Would you help me? Of course, Emily smiled warmly. We could start with new art supplies. I noticed Yana loves drawing. She showed me her butterfly picture today, Richard said, a small smile touching his lips. The wings were different colors. She said she likes them better that way. Emily began making notes on her tablet. We could also arrange for some educational programs at the orphanage. Reading programs, art classes, things that would benefit all the children but give you more opportunities to spend time with Yana. Thank you, Emily, Richard said quietly, for understanding and for helping. Everyone deserves a second chance, Emily replied, her voice gentle but firm. Even CEOs who think they're made of stone. For the first time in years, Richard felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. He had a long way to go to make things right, but he wasn't alone anymore. With Emily's help, he could start building the bridge between his past mistakes and a future with his daughter. The winter sun cast long shadows through Mrs. Lawson's office window as Richard sat across from her desk, his fingers drumming nervously on his knee. Outside, children's laughter echoed from the playground, a cheerful backdrop to the heavy conversation about to unfold. Mrs. Lawson, Richard began, his voice low and serious. There's something I need to discuss with you about Yana. Mrs. Lawson folded her hands on her desk, her experienced eyes studying him carefully. I've noticed your frequent visits, Mr. Stanton. I assume this has something to do with why you've taken such an interest in her. Unknown to them both, tiny footsteps had padded down the hallway. Yana, clutching a drawing she'd made for Richard, stopped short of the partially open door when she heard her name. It's about her mother, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. Clara Edwards. I knew her. Yana's small hand tightened around her drawing, her heart beating faster at the mention of her mother's name. Clara worked for me, Richard continued, unaware of his audience. When she told me she was pregnant, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I turned her away. I didn't want the responsibility. Mrs. Lawson's sharp intake of breath matched Yana's own. The little girl pressed closer to the door, her drawing now crumpled in her trembling hands. Mr. Stanton, Mrs. Lawson's voice was careful, measured. Are you saying you're Yana's father? The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Yes, Richard finally answered, his voice barely above a whisper. I've spent 5 years trying to forget, trying to convince myself she was better off without me. But seeing her at that Christmas party... Yana backed away from the door, her lower lip trembling. The pretty drawing of her and Richard holding hands beneath a rainbow fluttered to the floor, forgotten. She turned and ran, her small feet carrying her as fast as they could down the corridor. "I want to make it right," Richard was saying, oblivious to the hurt little girl fleeing from his words. "I know I don't deserve it, but I want to be part of her life." Mrs. Lawson's expression was troubled. "This is a delicate situation, Mr. Stanton. Yana is a sensitive child. Finding out about her mother, about you, it could be very confusing for her." Over the next few days, Richard noticed a change in Yana. Where once she'd run to greet him with excited hugs, now she hung back, watching him with wary eyes. When he tried to show her the new art supplies he'd brought, she merely shrugged and walked away. "She's not feeling well," Mrs. Lawson would say, but her concerned glances told a different story. During his visits, Yana would find reasons to be elsewhere. If Richard joined the children during story time, she would sit at the far end of the room. When he brought special treats for everyone, she would take hers quietly and disappear into the dormitory. The distance grew like a wall between them, brick by brick, built from Yana's confusion and hurt. She couldn't understand why the man who had abandoned her mother would suddenly want to be in her life. Every time she looked at him now, she wondered if he would leave again, just like he'd left before. Mrs. Lawson watched the situation unfold with growing worry, seeing how Yana withdrew not just from Richard, but from her friends as well. The usually bubbly child had become quiet and thoughtful, carrying a burden too heavy for her young shoulders. Richard sat across from Yana at a cozy corner table in the orphanage's small dining room. He'd arranged for a special lunch of chicken nuggets and French fries. Foods Mrs. Lawson had mentioned were Yana's favorites. The little girl picked at her food, her eyes downcast. "You know," Richard began softly, "when I was your age, I used to love building blanket forts." Yana glanced up, a flicker of interest crossing her face. "Really?" she asked quietly. "Oh yes, I'd use every blanket and pillow I could find," Richard continued, warming to the memory. "My mother would get so upset when she couldn't find her good sheets." A tiny smile tugged at the corner of Yana's mouth. "We make forts too sometimes, when it rains." Richard leaned forward, his voice animated. "I once tried to live in my fort for 3 whole days. I packed sandwiches and everything." "What happened?" Yana asked, finally taking a bite of her food. "I got hungry for my mom's spaghetti," Richard admitted, making Yana giggle despite herself. They shared a few more stories as they ate, Richard telling her about the time he tried to teach his pet goldfish tricks, and Yana cautiously sharing tales about the orphanage's resident cat, Mr. Whiskers. But then Yana put down her fork, her small face suddenly serious. "Why do you keep coming here? Why do you care about me so much?" Richard's heart clenched at the directness of her question. He wanted desperately to tell her everything, but knew it wasn't the right time. Instead, he looked into her questioning eyes and said gently, "I just want to make sure you have the best Christmas ever." Yana studied him carefully, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. The silence stretched between them until Mrs. Lawson appeared at their table. "Yana dear," she said warmly, "we're about to start rehearsals for the Christmas play. Would you like to be Mary this year?" Yana's eyes widened. It was the most important role, usually given to older children. She glanced at Richard, then back at Mrs. Lawson. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll do it." Richard beamed at her, but Yana's returning smile was hesitant, guarded. Though she'd agreed to share lunch and take part in the play, her trust in him remained fragile, like a delicate ornament that could shatter at the slightest touch. In the days following their lunch, Yana threw herself into play rehearsals with surprising intensity. Her small face scrunched in concentration as she practiced her lines, clutching the baby doll that would represent Jesus. The other children watched in amazement as their usually playful friend took on a serious demeanor. "That's wonderful, Yana," Mrs. Lawson encouraged, helping her adjust the makeshift blue shawl around her shoulders. "You're doing such a lovely job." Meanwhile, Richard worked behind the scenes, determined to make the orphanage's Christmas celebration unforgettable. He arranged for new costumes, proper stage lighting, and even hired a professional set designer to create a beautiful stable scene. "Mr. Stanton, Emily said one afternoon, reviewing his latest list of donations. "This is remarkable." She watched her boss with wonder, barely recognizing the man who once canceled the office Christmas party to save money. "Is it too much?" Richard asked, genuine concern in his voice. "I don't want to overwhelm them." Emily shook her head, smiling. "It's perfect." One evening, Richard quietly slipped into the back of the orphanage's small auditorium during rehearsal. Yana stood center stage, cradling the baby doll with such tenderness that Richard's throat tightened with emotion. "And she wrapped him in swaddling clothes," Yana recited carefully, her voice clear and sweet, "and laid him in a manger." Richard watched, transfixed, as she gently placed the doll in the wooden manger. Mrs. Lawson had to prompt the next child to speak, as everyone seemed caught in the spell of Yana's performance. Tears welled in Richard's eyes as he observed his daughter, this precious child he'd denied for so long. Her gentleness, her dedication, her pure heart, all of it made him ache with the desire to be part of her life, to make up for lost time. Emily, who had accompanied him, quietly placed a tissue in his hand. "She's remarkable," she whispered. "She is," Richard agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "Just like her mother." On stage, Yana continued her rehearsal, unaware of her father's presence. But something had shifted in her performance, a warmth, a hope that hadn't been there before. Despite her confusion about Richard, despite her overheard conversations and lingering questions, she found herself wanting to make this play special, not just for herself or the orphanage, but for the man who kept showing up, trying so hard to bring magic into their lives. Emily sat at her desk the next morning, tapping her pen thoughtfully against her notepad. The change in Richard over the past weeks had been remarkable, but his struggle to connect with Yana was breaking her heart. After a moment of consideration, she grabbed her purse and headed to the nearest bookstore. An hour later, Emily walked through the orphanage doors, her arms laden with colorful books and art supplies. Mrs. Lawson greeted her warmly. "What a lovely surprise, Ms. Saunders. The children will be thrilled." Emily found Yana sitting alone by the window, hugging her knees to her chest. "Would you like to read a story with me?" Emily asked gently, holding up a book about a little girl and her teddy bear's adventures. Yana's eyes lit up despite her hesitation. "Okay," she said softly, scooting over to make room. As Emily read, other children gathered around, drawn by the warmth in her voice. Yana gradually relaxed, leaning closer to see the pictures. "You know," Emily said during a pause between pages, "Mr. Stanton loves this story too. He has a copy in his office." Yana looked up, curiosity evident in her brown eyes. "Really? Why does he come here so much?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily smiled softly, choosing her words carefully. "I think he sees how special you all are, especially you, Yana. He wants to be your friend if you'll let him." "But why me?" Yana persisted. "Sometimes," Emily replied, "people come into our lives because they're meant to be there. Mr. Stanton might seem serious, but he has a very kind heart." Some of the other children chimed in, mentioning the new play costumes and the amazing Christmas decorations Richard had arranged. "He's not as scary as he looks," one little boy declared, making everyone giggle. Yana remained quiet, but Emily noticed her small smile as the children shared their thoughts about Richard. The wall of uncertainty around her seemed to crack, just a little. As Emily prepared to leave, Yana tugged at her sleeve. "Will you come read to us again?" she asked hopefully. "Of course, sweetheart, I'd love to." Richard sat at one of the small tables in the orphanage's activity room, his large hands fumbling with delicate strips of red and green paper. The children around him were expertly creating paper chains for the Christmas celebration, while his attempts kept falling apart. "No, Mr. Stanton," Yana said from across the table, where she'd been watching him struggle. "You have to fold it like this." She demonstrated with her own piece of paper, her small fingers moving with surprising skill. Richard tried to copy her movement but managed to crease the paper in the wrong place, creating a messy zigzag instead of a neat loop. The paper chain fell apart in his hands. A giggle escaped Yana's lips, the first time she'd laughed in his presence. The sound was like music to his ears. "Here, let me help," she offered, sliding closer. She placed her tiny hands over his much larger ones, guiding them through the motions. See? Gentle, like you're holding a butterfly. Richard's heart swelled as they worked together, creating one wobbly link after another. More giggles bubbled up from Yana as he continued to make mistakes, but there was no judgment in her laughter, only joy. "You're not very good at this," she observed, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "No, I suppose I'm not," Richard admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "I spend too much time with boring grown-up papers." Yana's face grew thoughtful as she helped him attach another link. "Why do you keep coming here?" she asked softly, her hands pausing in their work. "You're here all the time now." Richard set down his mangled paper chain and looked directly into her questioning eyes. "Because you're special," he said gently, "and I want to be here for you." Yana ducked her head, but not before Richard caught the small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She picked up another strip of paper and handed it to him. "Maybe we can practice until you get better at making chains," she suggested. "I'd like that very much," Richard replied, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The evening air was crisp and cold as the children from the orphanage gathered outside Stanton Enterprises. A massive evergreen tree stood in the courtyard, its branches still dark against the twilight sky. Emily Saunders moved through the crowd, passing out steaming cups of hot cocoa topped with whipped cream and candy cane stirs. Richard watched as Yana bounced on her toes, her mittened hands wrapped around her cocoa cup. Her eyes were wide with wonder as the carolers, dressed in Victorian-style costumes, began singing Silent Night. "Are you ready for the big moment?" Richard asked, kneeling beside her. Yana nodded eagerly. "Will it be really bright?" "The brightest tree in the city," he promised, leading her to a small platform where a golden switch waited. Mrs. Harriet Lawson watched from nearby, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as she saw how tenderly Richard guided Yana up the steps. The other children gathered closer, their faces glowing with excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "This year, we have a very special guest to help us light our Christmas tree. Yana, would you do us the honor?" She reached for the switch, then hesitated. "Can you help me?" she asked softly. Richard placed his hand over hers, and together they pulled the switch. The tree burst into life, thousands of twinkling lights spreading from bottom to top like falling stars in reverse. The children gasped in delight, and the carolers began singing "O Christmas Tree." Yana's face lit up brighter than the tree itself. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Richard felt his heart constrict as he watched her joy. "You know," he said quietly, just for her ears, "I wish I had been there for all your Christmases before this one." Yana turned to look at him, her expression curious and thoughtful. The lights from the tree reflected in her eyes as she studied his face, seeming to search for something there. Emily approached with more hot cocoa but stopped short, not wanting to interrupt the moment between them. She exchanged a knowing look with Mrs. Lawson as they watched Richard and Yana standing together in the glow of the Christmas tree, while the carolers' voices filled the winter air with music. The next morning, Yana sat quietly in a corner of Stanton Enterprises' lobby, waiting for Mrs. Lawson to finish speaking with the receptionist. Two women in business suits walked past, their voices carrying across the marble floor. "Did you hear about Mr. Stanton's past?" one whispered, not noticing the small girl nearby. "Apparently, he abandoned some woman and their baby years ago, just left them with nothing." "No way," the other gasped. "That poor child. I heard he's trying to make up for it now. But how do you fix something like that?" Yana's heart started beating faster. She thought about the photo in Richard's wallet, about his strange behavior, about all his visits to the orphanage. Her lower lip trembled as pieces started falling into place. No. Later that week, when Richard came to visit the orphanage, Yana pretended to be sick. She pulled her blanket up to her chin and turned away from the door when she heard his footsteps. "She's not feeling well today," Mrs. Lawson explained softly. Richard stood in the doorway, his face etched with concern. "Can I bring you anything, Yana? Some soup, maybe?" Yana shook her head without turning around, her eyes filling with tears. Back at his office, Richard paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair. Emily watched from the doorway, her face full of sympathy. "She won't even look at me, Emily," he said, his voice cracking. "Something's changed, but I don't know what happened." Emily closed the office door and sat down. Maybe she heard something? The office has been buzzing with rumors since the Christmas party. Richard stopped pacing, his face going pale. "You think she knows?" "Not everything," Emily said gently, "but enough to be confused and hurt. Children understand more than we give them credit for." Richard sank into his chair, looking more vulnerable than Emily had ever seen him. "I was waiting for the right time to tell her. I wanted her to trust me first, to know that I've changed." "The longer you wait," Emily advised, "the harder it will be. She needs the truth, Richard, even if it's difficult." Richard nodded slowly, knowing Emily was right. The weight of his past mistakes felt heavier than ever, as he realized his carefully laid plans were unraveling. Richard found Yana sitting alone on a wooden bench in the orphanage garden, her small shoulders hunched as she traced patterns in the dirt with her shoe. His heart ached at the sight of her looking so lost and confused. "May I sit with you?" he asked softly. Yana shrugged but moved over slightly, making space on the bench. Richard lowered himself down, his knees cracking as he settled beside her. "I think you've heard some things that might have upset you," he began, his voice gentle. "And I need to tell you something very important." Yana kept her eyes on the ground, but he could see her listening intently. "A long time ago, I made a very big mistake," Richard continued, his words careful and measured. "Your mother, Clara, came to me and told me about you before you were born. But I was scared and selfish. I told her I couldn't help and I walked away." Yana's small hands gripped the edge of the bench tightly. "Is that why I'm here? At the orphanage?" Richard's voice cracked as he answered, "Yes, and it's the biggest regret of my life. When I saw you at the Christmas party, I recognized you immediately. You looked just like your mother." Tears started rolling down Yana's cheeks. "The picture in your wallet?" "Yes," Richard whispered. "I've been keeping track of you all these years, but I was too much of a coward to come forward. I'm not that same person anymore, Yana, and I want to try to make things right, if you'll let me." Yana finally looked up at him, her eyes wide and glistening. "You really are my family." Richard felt his own eyes welling up as he nodded. "If you'll have me," he replied softly. Mrs. Lawson watched quietly from the doorway, as father and daughter shared this delicate moment, her heart full of hope for both of them. The morning sun cast warm squares of light across the orphanage's main room as Richard entered, carrying a small velvet box. His hands trembled slightly as he approached Yana, who sat at a table coloring with some of the other children. "Good morning, Yana," he said softly. "I brought something for you." Yana looked up, her crayon pausing mid-stroke. The other children watched curiously as Richard knelt beside her chair and opened the box. Inside lay a delicate silver locket, its surface catching the sunlight. "This is very special," he explained, carefully removing the locket. "Look inside." Yana's small fingers worked the clasp and the locket opened to reveal her school picture on one side. The other side was empty. "That space is for a picture of us together," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "When you're ready." Yana traced the edge of the locket with her finger, her expression thoughtful. "You have to prove you'll stay," she said quietly, looking directly into his eyes. "Everyone else leaves." Richard's heart clenched at her words. He took her small hand in his. "I promise you, Yana, I will never leave you again. Never." Mrs. Lawson appeared with boxes of Christmas decorations, breaking the intensity of the moment. "Who wants to help decorate?" she called out cheerfully. Yana carefully placed the locket around her neck, then grabbed Richard's hand. "Come on," she said. "You can help me with the tinsel." They spent the next few hours transforming the orphanage's common room. Richard lifted Yana to hang decorations in high places, and she giggled when he tangled himself in garland. Together, they created paper snowflakes, though Richard's looked more like crumpled masses than delicate designs. "You're not very good at this," Yana observed, holding up her perfect snowflake next to his misshapen attempt. Richard laughed. "No, I'm not. Maybe you could teach me." Yana's face brightened. "Okay, but you have to follow my instructions exactly." She demonstrated the proper folding technique, her small hands guiding his larger ones with surprising patience. As they worked side by side, Mrs. Lawson noticed Yana's hand occasionally reaching up to touch the locket, as if reassuring herself it was still there. The little girl who had always kept herself slightly apart from others was beginning to lean into the possibility of family, one careful moment at a time. As the afternoon light filtered through the orphanage windows, Richard stood in Mrs. Lawson's modest office, his hands clasped behind his back. "I want to organize a Christmas celebration unlike anything these children have ever seen," he said, his voice filled with determination. "Complete with a professional catering service, live entertainment, and gifts for every child." Mrs. Lawson peered at him over her reading glasses, her expression cautious. "Mr. Stanton, while I appreciate the gesture, I have to ask, why now? These children have been here for years, and Stanton Enterprises has never shown such interest before." Richard's shoulders tensed slightly. "This isn't about publicity or my company's image, Mrs. Lawson. I've learned something important these past few weeks." He paused, his voice softening. "These children deserve magic in their lives, especially during Christmas." Unknown to both adults, Yana sat cross-legged in the hallway just outside the office door, her ear pressed close to the gap. She clutched her new locket, listening intently. "I want to transform the community center next door," Richard continued. "We'll have a grand Christmas tree, holiday music, decorations everywhere. Each child will receive personally selected gifts." His eyes grew warm with emotion. "I want them to feel special, to know they matter." Mrs. Lawson's stern expression began to soften. "And this has nothing to do with improving your public image?" "No press, no cameras, no publicity," Richard replied firmly. "This is about the children. Only the children." In the hallway, Yana's face broke into a small, secret smile as she heard the sincerity in Richard's voice. She touched the empty side of her locket, imagining the picture that would someday fill it. Mrs. Lawson studied Richard's face for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Very well, Mr. Stanton, but I'll be holding you to your word about this being for the children." "Thank you," Richard said, relief evident in his voice. "I promise you won't regret this, and please call me Richard." As they began discussing the details, Yana quietly slipped away from the door, her heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. For the first time, she truly believed that Richard meant what he said about staying. The community center buzzed with excitement as Yana practiced her lines for the Christmas play. She stood center stage in her makeshift angel costume, a white sheet draped over her shoulders, and a tinfoil halo bobbing slightly above her dark curls. "And lo," she proclaimed, spreading her arms wide, "I bring you tidings of great joy." Her voice rang clear and sweet through the room, making the other children pause their chattering to watch. Unknown to Yana, Richard stood in the shadows near the back entrance, his heart swelling with pride. He watched as she twirled across the stage, her face glowing with pure happiness. His eyes grew misty as she delivered each line with careful precision, her small hands gesturing dramatically. "Yana's got a special audience," whispered Tommy, one of the older boys, nudging Sarah beside him. The children giggled, stealing glances at Richard. During a break in rehearsal, Lucy, Yana's best friend, skipped over to her. "Your daddy came to watch you," she teased in a sing-song voice. "He looks like he's gonna cry." Yana's cheeks turned pink, but a small smile played at her lips. "He's not crying," she protested softly, sneaking a peek at Richard. "He's just watching." "He comes to every rehearsal," Tommy chimed in, grinning. "Bet he'll sit right in the front row on opening night." The other children joined in the playful teasing, making Yana's blush deepen, but there was no malice in their words, only the warmth of shared joy at seeing their friend so happy. Richard observed the scene from his spot in the shadows, his chest tight with emotion. The transformation in Yana over the past weeks had been remarkable. Gone was the guarded, uncertain child who had pulled away from him. In her place stood a confident little girl who practically glowed with excitement. As Yana returned to her position on stage, she caught Richard's eye and gave him a tiny wave. He smiled back, wiping quickly at his eyes. The other children noticed this exchange and burst into another round of good-natured giggles. "Okay, everyone," called Mrs. Peterson, the play director. "Let's take it from the top. Yana, remember to project your voice." Yana nodded earnestly, adjusting her tinfoil halo. Before starting her lines again, she glanced once more at Richard, her eyes sparkling. This time she didn't mind when Tommy whispered, "Look how proud he is." She just smiled and began her scene, her voice ringing out clear and true. The next morning, Richard arrived at the orphanage carrying several large boxes. Mrs. Harriet Lawson watched with curiosity as he set them down in the common room. "Children," she called out, "Mr. Stanton has brought something special for you all." The kids gathered around, their eyes wide with excitement. Richard cleared his throat, suddenly feeling a bit nervous under their eager gazes. "I thought you might like to capture some memories of your Christmas celebrations," he said, opening the boxes to reveal dozens of instant cameras. The room erupted in gasps and squeals of delight. Yana bounced on her toes as she received her camera, examining it with wonder. "Look, the pictures come right out," she exclaimed, watching as Tommy snapped the first photo. "Here, let me show you how to use it," Richard said, kneeling beside Yana. He guided her small hands to the right buttons, and her face lit up when she took her first picture of the Christmas tree. Soon the orphanage was filled with clicking sounds and laughter, as children captured everything in sight. Yana darted from friend to friend, taking pictures of their smiling faces and the festive decorations adorning the walls. "Mr. Stanton," she called out, turning the camera toward him. "Smile." Richard, usually uncomfortable in front of cameras, found himself grinning naturally as Yana snapped several photos. She giggled when one picture showed him mid-blink. As the afternoon wore on, the children gathered to compare their photos, trading them like precious treasures. Yana sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully arranging her collection. Just before Richard prepared to leave, Yana approached him holding one particular photo. It showed him laughing as he helped decorate cookies with frosting smudged on his nose. "This is for you," she said softly, holding out the picture. "So you'll always remember me." Richard's throat tightened as he accepted the photo, touched by the simple gesture. "Thank you, Yana," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Harriet Lawson observed the exchange from across the room, noting how naturally Yana now interacted with Richard, so different from her initial wariness just weeks ago. The next morning, Richard sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, facing the stern faces of his board members. The quarterly reports lay untouched before them. "Mr. Stanton," Marcus Henderson, the senior board member, cleared his throat. "We're concerned about your recent distractions. The orphanage visits, the charity events, they're taking up valuable company time." "Our stock has dipped 3 points," Janet Chen added, tapping her pen against the table. "Shareholders are asking questions about your commitment to the company." Richard straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening. Emily Saunders, seated in the corner taking notes, watched him with concern. "I understand your concerns," Richard said, his voice steady, "but my priorities have changed. The company is doing well, and we can afford to focus on more than just profits." "With all due respect," Marcus interjected, "your personal matters shouldn't interfere with—" "Personal matters?" Richard stood up, his hands pressed firmly on the table. "That orphanage, those children, they represent everything we've ignored in our pursuit of profit. And Yana," his voice softened slightly, "she's my daughter and I won't abandon her again." The room fell silent. Emily noticed Richard's hands trembling slightly, though his face remained composed. "I've spent years putting this company first," he continued, "but I won't sacrifice another chance to be there for my daughter. If that's a problem, you're welcome to call a vote of confidence." The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Richard gathered his papers, his movements deliberate and controlled, but Emily could see how the confrontation had affected him. As the board members filed out, Richard remained standing, staring out the window. Emily approached quietly. "Are you all right, sir?" "I've never been better, Emily," he replied, though his voice was strained. "For the first time in my life, I know exactly what matters." At the orphanage, Yana sat on her bed, holding the locket Richard had given her. Her small fingers traced the empty space where their picture together should go. Outside her window, expensive cars zoomed past, reminding her of Richard's fancy office and important meetings. Mrs. Lawson had told her Richard was visiting today, but instead of feeling excited, her tummy felt tight with worry. She thought about his big house, his important job, and all the grown-ups in suits who worked for him. Her world of shared bedrooms and hand-me-down toys seemed so different. When Richard arrived, he found Yana quieter than usual. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, sitting beside her on the bed. Yana clutched her locket tighter. "Your world is so different from mine," she whispered, her voice shaky. What if you decide you don't want to be here anymore? Everyone else left." Richard's heart ached at her words. He reached into his coat and pulled out an old wooden box with brass corners. "Yana, I want to show you something special." He held out a small silver key. "This box holds everything important from my life. Things I've never shown anyone else." Yana took the key carefully, her eyes wide. When she opened the box, she found old photographs, a baseball ticket stub, and a tiny pair of baby shoes. "These were my first shoes," Richard explained softly. "My mother kept them to remind me where I came from. We didn't always have nice things either." He picked up a faded photograph. "See? That's me at your age, living in a small apartment with my mom." Yana touched the baby shoes gently. "Really?" "Yes, really." Richard put his arm around her shoulders. "You're my family now, Yana, and I won't let you go. Ever. This key is yours to keep, so you'll always know I trust you with my heart." Tears welled up in Yana's eyes as she hugged Richard tightly. "Promise?" she whispered against his shoulder. "I promise," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your world is my world now, and nothing will change that." The orphanage hallways buzzed with excited chatter as children hung paper snowflakes and strung popcorn garlands. The smell of fresh pine and cinnamon filled the air, while Christmas carols played softly from an old radio in the corner. In the small reading nook by the window, Richard and Yana worked together on a modest 3-foot tree. It wasn't as grand as the one at Stanton Enterprises, but somehow it felt more special. "The star goes on top, right?" Yana asked, carefully holding the tarnished ornament in her small hands. Richard smiled, lifting her up so she could reach. "Perfect spot for it. You know, when I was little, decorating the tree was my favorite part of Christmas." "Really?" Yana's eyes sparkled with interest as she adjusted the star. "What else did you like?" "Well," Richard said, setting her down gently, "I loved waking up early on Christmas morning, tiptoeing to see what Santa brought." They continued adding ornaments to the tree, some handmade by the children, others donated over the years. Yana handed Richard a paper angel she'd made, complete with glitter and crooked wings. "This one's special," she declared. "I made it just for our tree." Richard's heart warmed at the word "our." He carefully placed the angel on a prominent branch. Mrs. Lawson passed by carrying a box of decorations. She smiled at the sight of them working together, noticing how natural they looked as father and daughter. Yana grew quiet for a moment, fiddling with a ribbon in her hands. "Mr. Richard," she asked softly, Will you stay for Christmas morning? It wouldn't be the same without you." Richard knelt down beside her, his eyes misty. "Are you sure you want me here?" Yana nodded earnestly. "You have to see me open my presents and have breakfast with us and everything." She looked up at him hopefully. "Please." "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. They finished decorating their little tree in comfortable silence, both smiling at how perfectly imperfect it looked. Around them, the orphanage continued its cheerful preparations, but in their quiet corner, Father and daughter had found their own special moment of Christmas magic. The grand ballroom at Stanton Enterprises sparkled like a scene from a fairy tale. Crystalline snowflakes hung from the ceiling, catching the light and casting magical shadows across the room. The massive Christmas tree, reaching nearly to the ceiling, twinkled with thousands of white lights and silver ornaments. Children from the orphanage streamed through the doors, their eyes wide with wonder. Richard stood at the entrance, greeting each child personally. Gone was his usual stern expression, replaced by a genuine warmth that transformed his entire face. "Welcome, welcome," he said, bending down to shake tiny hands and accept enthusiastic hugs from the younger children. When Yana arrived, already dressed in her angel costume with sparkly wings, she threw her arms around his waist. "It's beautiful," she exclaimed, her face glowing with joy. "Just wait until you see everything else," Richard replied, squeezing her shoulder gently. Emily Saunders directed the children to their seats while Mrs. Lawson helped organize the performers backstage. The excitement in the room was palpable as the Christmas play began. When Yana stepped onto the stage, Richard's heart swelled with pride. She delivered her lines perfectly, her voice clear and confident as she spread her wings and spoke about hope and love. The spotlight caught the locket around her neck, the one he had given her, making it sparkle like a star. "Christmas is a time for miracles," Yana proclaimed, her eyes finding Richard's in the audience. "A time when hearts can change and families can grow in unexpected ways." As the play concluded, the audience erupted in applause. Richard jumped to his feet, clapping harder than anyone else, tears glistening in his eyes. Yana beamed from the stage, taking an extra bow as the other children joined her. Mrs. Lawson wiped away tears of her own, watching the transformation that had taken place in both Richard and Yana. The stern CEO, who had once cared only about profit margins, now stood surrounded by children, his face radiating joy as he led them to the mountain of presents beneath the tree. Emily Saunders appeared at his side with a camera, capturing the moment as Yana hugged Richard again, both of them laughing as silver confetti rained down from above. The other children gathered around, their faces bright with happiness and wonder at the magical celebration Richard had created for them. After the applause died down and the children gathered around the Christmas tree, Richard pulled Yana aside. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a carefully wrapped package topped with a silver bow. "I have something special for you," he said softly, leading her to a quiet corner of the ballroom where a plush velvet settee waited. Yana's eyes sparkled with curiosity as she carefully unwrapped the gift. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound book with her name embossed in gold letters on the cover. When she opened it, she gasped. The first page showed a photo from the Christmas party where they'd first met, Yana exploring the ballroom with wonder in her eyes. Page after page captured their journey together, decorating cookies at the orphanage, Richard's clumsy attempts at craft making that had made her laugh, the tree lighting ceremony where she'd pulled the switch, and countless small moments in between. "Emily helped me gather all the pictures," Richard explained, his voice soft with emotion. "But look, there's more." He turned to the middle of the book, where blank pages waited. At the top of one page, in elegant script, were the words, "Memories we'll make in the future." "Because this is just the beginning," Richard said, his voice catching. "There are so many more memories we'll create together if you'll let me be part of your life." Yana ran her small fingers over the empty pages, then looked back at the photos they'd already shared. Tears welled up in her eyes as she studied a picture of Richard reading her a bedtime story at the orphanage, his expression full of love and tenderness. She turned to face him, her lower lip trembling slightly. Then, throwing her arms around his neck, she whispered the words he'd been longing to hear. "I think I'm ready to call you Dad." Richard's breath caught in his throat. Tears spilled down his cheeks as he held her close, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. All the years of regret, all the missed moments, they couldn't be erased, but this new beginning felt like a miracle. Across the room, Emily Saunders watched the scene unfold. Her own eyes grew misty as she remembered the cold, distant man who had once occupied the CEO's office. The transformation she'd witnessed over the past weeks had been remarkable, Where there had once been emptiness in Richard's eyes, there was now warmth and purpose. Where there had been rigid formality, there was now genuine joy. Yana snuggled closer to Richard, the scrapbook cradled in her arms. "Can we take more pictures tonight?" she asked. "For our future memories?" "Of course we can," Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. He held her tighter, treasuring the weight of her trust and love. The word "Dad" echoed in his heart, healing wounds he hadn't even known were there. Around them, the Christmas celebration continued, filled with laughter and music, but in their quiet corner, father and daughter remained wrapped in their own special moment, the scrapbook between them holding both their past and their promise of tomorrow. Christmas morning dawned crisp and bright at the orphanage. The children were already awake, their excited whispers echoing through the halls when Richard Stanton arrived, his arms laden with colorfully wrapped packages. Behind him, caterers wheeled in carts filled with the aroma of fresh waffles, crispy bacon, and hot chocolate topped with whipped cream. "Merry Christmas!" Richard called out, his face breaking into a warm smile as the children rushed to greet him. Yana hung back for a moment, watching her father with pride before running into his open arms. "You came," she exclaimed, burying her face in his winter coat. "Of course I did. I wouldn't miss our first Christmas together for anything in the world." Mrs. Harriet Lawson watched from the doorway, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as the children gathered around the breakfast table. Richard had arranged everything perfectly. Festive plates, candy cane-striped napkins, and tiny gift boxes at each place setting. After breakfast, the gift-giving began. Richard handed out presents to each child, having carefully selected items based on their individual interests and wishes. There were art supplies for Tommy, who loved to draw, a science kit for Sarah, who dreamed of becoming a doctor, and new books for Michael, the avid reader. When it came time for Yana's gift, Richard pulled out a special package wrapped in silver paper with golden stars. She unwrapped it carefully, gasping when she revealed an exquisite snow globe. Inside, a tiny angel danced among sparkling snowflakes, and at the base, golden letters spelled out, "To my shining star, Yana." "It's beautiful," she whispered, turning it over in her hands. When she shook it, the glitter swirled like stardust around the angel. "Just like you," Richard said softly, his eyes twinkling with joy as he watched her face light up. "Your dad is so cool," Tommy exclaimed, peering over Yana's shoulder at the snow globe. "Way cooler than we thought a CEO would be." "Yeah," Sarah chimed in. "You're lucky to have the coolest dad ever." Yana laughed, her chest swelling with pride. "I know," she said, beaming up at Richard. "He really is the best." The morning unfolded with games and laughter. Richard joined in enthusiastically, even attempting to win at musical chairs, which sent the children into fits of giggles when he nearly toppled over trying to claim the last seat. During a quiet moment, while the other children were playing with their new toys, Yana sat beside Richard on the window seat, still holding her snow globe. "I'm going to keep this forever," she said seriously, watching the glitter settle around the angel. "That way I'll always remember our first Christmas together." Richard wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "And we'll have many more Christmases to remember," he promised, his heart full as he watched the joy dancing in his daughter's eyes. Mrs. Harriet Lawson observed the scene from across the room, marveling at how naturally Richard had transformed from the stern CEO into this loving father who brought such happiness to the orphanage. The sound of children's laughter filled the air, mixing with the soft Christmas music playing in the background, creating a perfect symphony of joy and belonging. Later that Christmas morning, Richard Stanton sat in Mrs. Harriet Lawson's modest office at the orphanage, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Through the window, he could hear the children's laughter as they played with their new toys. "Mrs. Lawson," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I want to discuss something important with you about Yana." Mrs. Lawson smiled warmly, having noticed the profound change in the once stern CEO over the past weeks. "Of course, Mr. Stanton." "I want to adopt her," he said simply, his eyes filled with determination. "I know I have a lot to make up for, but I want to give her the home and family she deserves." Mrs. Lawson leaned forward, tears welling in her eyes. Mr. Stanton, I've worked in this orphanage for 20 years, and I've never seen such a remarkable transformation in anyone. The way you've opened your heart to these children, especially Yana. She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. You have my full support. Richard's shoulders relaxed visibly. Thank you. I've already asked Emily to begin the necessary paperwork, but your blessing means everything. Now comes the most important part, Mrs. Lawson said gently, asking Yana. Richard found Yana in the playroom, carefully arranging her new snow globe on a shelf. His heart swelled at the sight of her, this precious child who had changed his life so completely. Yana, sweetheart, can we talk for a minute? She turned to him with a bright smile, skipping over to where he knelt. Richard took her small hands in his, trying to steady his racing heart. Yana, you know how much I love you, right? She nodded enthusiastically. I love you too, Dad. The word still made his heart skip a beat every time she said it. Well, I was wondering, how would you feel about making it official? Would you like to be my daughter? Really and truly, with all the proper papers and everything? Yana's eyes widened, and for a moment Richard's heart stopped, worried he'd moved too fast. Then her face broke into the most radiant smile he'd ever seen. But I already thought you were, she exclaimed, throwing herself into his arms with such force that they both tumbled backward onto the carpet, laughing. Is that a yes? He asked, hugging her tightly. Yes, yes, yes. Yana peppered his face with kisses, giggling with pure joy. In her office at Stanton Enterprises, Emily Saunders was already hard at work, organizing the adoption paperwork with meticulous care. She smiled as she filled out the forms, remembering the cold, distant man Richard had been just months ago. The change in him was nothing short of miraculous. The phone on her desk buzzed. It was Richard, his voice filled with more happiness than she'd ever heard. She said yes, Emily. She said yes. That's wonderful news, sir, Emily replied, already adding more notes to her growing file. I'll make sure everything goes smoothly. We'll have this processed as quickly as possible. Back at the orphanage, Richard held Yana close, still sitting on the playroom floor. She played with his tie, a habit she'd developed over their time together. When will it be official? She asked, looking up at him with those bright, hopeful eyes. Soon, sweetheart, he promised, smoothing her hair. Emily's working on all the papers right now. But you know what? In our hearts, it's already real. The late January afternoon buzzed with excitement as Richard helped Yana carry her small suitcase into his spacious home. Her eyes widened as she took in the grand staircase and crystal chandelier, but what caught her attention most was the wall of windows overlooking a snow-covered garden. Can we really decorate my room however I want? Yana asked, bouncing on her toes as they climbed the stairs. Richard chuckled, his heart warming at her enthusiasm. Absolutely. We can paint it any color you choose. They reached the second floor, and Richard led her to a large room with bay windows. Yana gasped as she stepped inside. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow across the hardwood floors. This is all mine, she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. All yours, sweetheart. Richard set down her suitcase and watched as she explored every corner of the room, her fingers trailing along the walls. They spent the afternoon unpacking her belongings and planning the room's decoration. Richard had already purchased basic furniture, a bed with a canopy, a desk, and a bookshelf. But the walls remained bare, waiting for Yana's personal touch. Look, Dad. Yana pulled out the scrapbook he'd given her at Christmas. Can we hang some of these pictures? Of course we can. Richard retrieved a hammer and some picture hooks from his toolbox. Together they chose their favorite photos and arranged them on the wall. Yana directed the placement of each picture with careful consideration. This one should go here, she said, pointing to a photo of them decorating the orphanage Christmas tree. And this one next to it. It was a snapshot of her performance as an angel in the Christmas play. As they worked, Richard found himself stealing glances at his daughter, still amazed by how naturally she'd settled into calling him Dad. Each time she said it, his heart swelled with joy and gratitude. They hung her drawings next, colorful masterpieces she'd created during their time together. One showed stick figures of her and Richard holding hands with "My Dad" written in wobbly letters across the top. As evening approached, Richard lit a fire in the living room fireplace. He prepared hot cocoa with extra marshmallows, just the way Yana liked it, and they settled into the plush sofa together. Yana curled up against his side, her small hands wrapped around her mug. The firelight danced across her face as she looked up at him with contentment. "Dad?" she said softly. "Yes, sweetheart?" "I've never been this happy before." She took a careful sip of her cocoa, leaving a tiny marshmallow mustache on her upper lip. "Never ever." Richard gently wiped away the marshmallow with his thumb, his throat tight with emotion. "Me neither, Yana. Me neither." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames flicker and dance. Yana's head gradually grew heavier against his arm as sleepiness began to overtake her excitement. "Should we head up to your new room?" Richard asked softly. Yana shook her head, snuggling closer. "Can we stay here just a little longer? It's so cozy." "As long as you want, sweetheart," Richard replied, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "As long as you want." The New Year's celebration at the orphanage sparkled with life and laughter. Colorful streamers and twinkling lights transformed the usually modest building into a festive wonderland. Richard Stanton stood at the front of the main room, his hand resting gently on Yana's shoulder as they faced Mrs. Harriet Lawson and the gathered children. "On behalf of Stanton Enterprises," Richard announced, his voice warm with emotion, "I'm honored to present this donation to ensure the orphanage's continued success." He handed Mrs. Lawson an envelope, and her eyes widened as she read the contents. "Mr. Stanton, this is incredibly generous," she stammered, tears welling in her eyes. "This will help so many children." Yana beamed up at her father, pride radiating from her smile. The other children crowded around, their excited chatter filling the room. Emily Saunders, standing nearby, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, touched by the scene before her. "That's not all," Richard continued, kneeling down to Yana's level. "We're also establishing a permanent scholarship fund for all the children here. Every child will have the opportunity to pursue their dreams through education." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Mrs. Lawson pulled Richard into a warm hug, whispering her heartfelt thanks. "Picture time," Emily called out, holding up a camera. The children gathered around Richard and Yana, their faces glowing with happiness. Some made silly faces, others struck poses, while the younger ones simply giggled with delight. "Everyone say Happy New Year," Emily directed, adjusting the camera. "Happy New Year!" the group chorused as the flash went off, capturing the joyful moment forever. As midnight approached, they all moved outside into the crisp winter air. The stars twinkled overhead, promising a beautiful display of fireworks to come. Richard wrapped a warm scarf around Yana's neck, making sure she was bundled up against the cold. The countdown began, led by the enthusiastic voices of the children. 10, 9, 8. Richard looked down at his daughter, marveling at how much his life had changed in just a few months. 7, 6, 5. Yana slipped her small hand into his, squeezing it tight with excitement. 4, 3, 2, 1. "Happy New Year!" everyone shouted as fireworks exploded overhead, painting the sky in brilliant colors. The children oohed and ahed at the spectacular display, their faces illuminated by the shimmering lights above. In the magical moment, Yana turned to Richard, her eyes reflecting the sparkling fireworks. "This is the best family I could ever wish for," she whispered, wrapping her arms around his waist in a tight hug. Richard held her close, his heart full of gratitude and love. Back in their home, on the mantel above the fireplace, sat the framed photo from their Christmas scrapbook, a reminder of where their journey began and the promise of many more memories to come. The fireworks continued to light up the night sky, casting a warm glow over the gathered crowd. The orphanage children danced and played, their laughter mixing with the pops and crackles overhead. Emily Saunders caught Richard's eye and gave him a knowing smile, remembering how far he'd come from the cold, distant CEO she'd known before. If you enjoyed the story of Richard and Yana, I hand-picked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.